So, welcome everyone to this year's Schumpeter Lecture organized by Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum. My name is Johan Eklund. I'm Professor of Economics and Managing Director of the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum. This lecture is this year we're giving it online, but usually we give it in Stockholm. And it's as the name implies, it's founded in the tradition of Schumpeter, who challenged orthodox economics and put the entrepreneur at the center stage of economic development. And I can mention a few of the previous lecturers. We have had lectures by Deirdre McCloskey, David Aldrich, Philippe Aghion, Saraswati, John Haltewanger, to mention a few of the previous lecturers. And as you can, from those of you familiar with these names, it shows the incredible width and broadness of the entrepreneurship field. This year, we have the pleasure and honor to have Professor Maria Minniti with us to give a lecture. Maria is a professor at Syracuse University and specialized in entrepreneurship, public policy, growth, institutions, and emergence of governance and organizations, I believe it says on your homepage. And I should say you're a professor both of entrepreneurship and public policy. I'm the moderator today, so I'll just distribute the word. And of course, the focus is on Maria's lecture. But with us, we also have Professor Kristina Nyström from the Royal Institute, who will offer comments on Maria's lecture. And we also have Professor Braunielm, who is both a professor at the Royal Institute in Stockholm, but also a colleague of mine and a research director of the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum. With these words, I should just say one or two things concerning the structure of this lecture. We are recording it, so it will be available on our homepage and social media afterwards. And I encourage all you who are participating to post questions and comments in the chat. And I will do my best to take notes of that and follow up with those questions after the lecture. With these words, I give the floor to you, Professor Minniti, and very welcome. And we are very happy and pleased to have you with us here today. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Johan, and thank you so much for having me. This is a real pleasure and an honor. You put me in such great company. Thank you so much for everybody who's participating, and of course to the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be able to give the Schumpeter lecture. Let me start by sharing my screen. I hope you can see it now well. So let me tell you very briefly about what I'm going to try to do today. It's really a conversation, part of sort of an ongoing research agenda that I'm developing with some very young scholars. And the topic today is Entrepreneurial Firms and Regulations in Emerging Industries. And as a context, as an example, I'm going to use the US non-military drone industry. And I sort of emphasize the US because I'm going to make reference to certain regulations that are specifically US regulations, but because they have such a broad impact, they can be used as a useful context for the argument. And so really the core of the lecture is about the entanglement between innovation, in particular technological innovation, the emergence of new industry as a result of this technological innovation, and the competitive structure and the competitive tension between different types of firms, namely entrepreneurial firms, which are usually the ones that drive the emergence of new industries, and incumbent that are already established in other fields and may decide to enter a field with a new technology. So there we go. So the common wisdom is basically that regulation, in whatever way defined, is able to change the quantity and speed of technological innovation. So it can be used to increase the rate of innovation in a country or in an industry, or the quantity of innovation that we have. But in general, it is treated, regulation is treated as sort of a black box that influences technological innovation as a blanket. And the same black box mentality, if you will, is applied to the firm that receives it. And so that's why we look at, just empirically, that's primarily what we can do, because we tend to look at R&D investment, research and development investment. We tend to look at patents rate, the quality of patents recently. And what I want to emphasize today is that there is another very important route that determines the relationship between regulation and innovation. And that's the fact that in the regulation influences the type of technological change we observe, the type of technology we have, the feature and characteristics of the technology we have. So fundamentally, I'm going to address three questions. Does regulation influence the type of technological innovation? So does it go beyond the quantity and speed? Does it influence, therefore, the competitive structure of an industry? In other words, does it affect certain firms more than others? And lately, because we are interested particularly in entrepreneurship, entrepreneurial firms, and because they tend to be the cradle of a lot of technological innovation, then I'm going to ask, okay, if that's the case, should entrepreneurial firms be involved more in the process of regulating technological innovation? So basically, a conversation around three questions. And let me immediately emphasize the answer. So you know already where I'm going, in a sense. Does regulation influence the type of technological innovation? The answer is definitely yes. And I hope to show you, to make the case for that. If it does, then does it alter also the competitive environment? In other words, does it affect asymmetrically different type of firms? The answer is yes, also with two exclamation points. And the third is, therefore, should their entrepreneurial firm be included explicitly in the regulatory process for technological innovation? And the answer is, again, yes. And the point why I'm claiming this is because normally we take entrepreneurial firms as regulation takers. Basically, they have no power. They don't have the resources to do lobbying. They are small, they are new, they don't have the connection. And the claim I'm going to make today instead is that actually entrepreneurial firms in emerging industries with a technology base, so in new technological industry, have an invaluable source of regulatory information, which is their competitive advantage in technological knowledge, which I argue, is fundamental in crafting regulation when and if necessary, that are actually conducive to more and better innovation as opposed to being a hindrance. So in a sense, what I'm saying is that entrepreneurial firms actually have agency in a regulatory context in a new technology-based industry and can be a powerful partner for both already established firms as well as pivotal regulatory agencies, basically the agencies that actually craft regulation. We sometimes tend to think of regulation as it is coming out of the blue, it suddenly appears. There is actually a process that informs what this regulation looks like. There is somebody who actually writes it, proposes it, and then eventually brings it to approval. So I'm going to use the example of drones. Look at this beauty. This is actually a taxi drone, fully operational. This is actually the Uber drone, fully operational. It was presented at the Las Vegas Drone Convention in 2019. So this thing could already, fly. It's in, perfectly functional, but we don't see it in our skies. The technology is still waiting. And so the question is why? Why choose the drone industry as my context? Because it emerged as a result of radical technological change. So it's a massive change with an enormous potential for various applications. Also, the breadth of the applicability makes it easy to relate to other industry and also argue and show how changes and regulatory constraints in the drone industry may have implications for parallel industry. Last, I chose it because, again, the argument I'm going to make, it applies in every industry, but it's particularly salient for new industry where the regulatory landscape is still uncertain. And what we have in the case of drones, it's interesting because it has been a very heavily regulated industry, even before it actually started, even before we had commercial product. We could make very similar argument when it comes to driverless cars, when it comes to robotics, especially robotics application to the medical field, to exoskeletons, and technical application to precision farming. So there are other industries we could have used. We just focus on this one because we think it makes an interesting case. And in fact, in this context, I should say that everything I will say is based on common joint work done with Almantas Palumbiskas, which is this person here. This is one of my former PhD students, currently an assistant professor of innovation at EN Lyon in France. And so basically, he arrived as a PhD student. He chose this fantastic topic. And so then I shipped him into an archive and had him spend 3 years there sorting through it. I think he sorted through almost 100,000 pages of government documents, newspaper articles, blogs, interviews that he conducted or secondary. So there is a massive amount of data collection beyond this. I will not do justice to it, we don't have time, but primarily this sort of the argument we are trying to present builds on evidence, again, from the US non-military drone industry. So a very specific context. What is a drone? A drone is an unmanned aerial vehicle, or normally referred to as an unmanned aerial system. Two things here are important. Number one is unmanned, so it flies, but there is no person driving it, or it doesn't need a person to drive it, which it's important later on. And two, it's a system. So the technology is a combination of subsystems. Some are core subsystems, they are necessary for its functioning. Others are peripheral in the sense that they provide services, but are not necessarily to the main function of this technology, which is the ability of flying objects from point A to point B without a person on board. This is I'm just going to give you some examples. This is actually historically the first drones. We're looking at about 1848. The Austrian Empire wasn't happy with Venice, and so they decided that they wanted to intimidate it somehow. And so they created fundamentally what is the first drone. Those things here are actually ballooned with explosives. They were released over Venice with the intent of having Venice submit. Actually, the wind didn't cooperate, so the balloons went, most of them went elsewhere, but they were intimidated enough that eventually Venice capitulated. So this is sort of an historical cultural culture. Normally, when we think about drones, we think of something that looks like this, a military drone. This is not what we're going to talk about. This is in itself a different story. What we're going to talk about instead is something that looks like this, which again, we have not seen in operation because in spite of the fact it is completely functional, it's illegal. And something that looks like this. This we have seen. There is a lot of them, about 500,000 only in the United States currently. This is a small drone without the camera, weighs about 200 grams. And there are a lot of consumers and commercial applications. This, for example, is an insurance application, so it flies over areas that have suffered some natural disaster and takes pictures. This is an application of a bigger version to actually, this is a James Bond movie. This is a version created for precision farming. So it's an agricultural application. This is a delivery of medical supplies in Rwanda. And it's interesting, it's Rwanda because this is an American company co-owned. This is the delivery of blood supplies in Switzerland, approved. This is actually a flying prototype of a smaller air taxi in Dubai, again, not in the United States, although the first air taxis was developed in the United States. And this is my student's favorite, is the surfing drone, which is completely illegal. So why am I showing you this picture? To sort of give you the breadth of application, and that's very small subset. So it's a pervasive, potentially transformative industry, similar to electricity, to information, to transportation. A lot of applications, innovation spanning is progressive, and yet, as we said, very slow to implement. And so the question is, why? And actually, we know that there are many instances in which we have examples of the technology that are perfectly functioning, but not yet implemented. I should make a clarification, by the way. Point of the talk is not, I'm not going to talk in favor or against regulation. This is not the point here. Point I'm trying to make is that regardless of regulatory intent, so even under the assumption of best intention, no lobbying pressure, and even regulatory neutrality, basically regulators have no commercial interest. Even under this condition, regulation represents an exogenous shock to an industry which has a lot of implication. In other words, it becomes deeply entangled with the feature of the technology we observe emerging. It shapes the way this technology is going to look like. And this is particularly important when a technology is new. So in emerging industry, when we don't have yet developed standards. So let's go back to the three questions we want to discuss today. The first one is, does regulation influence the type of technological innovation? Okay? And we already know the answer is yes. Okay? So let me see if I can convince you of why that would be true. When we look at technological innovation, technological change, basically we are looking, what we said before, at a system. Okay? So it's a system with core and peripheral parts. So in the case of a drone, for example, the motor is clearly a core system. If you don't have a motor, the drone doesn't fly. But different type of configuration for cameras, if it's a camera drone, the camera itself, propeller guides, all these things are peripheral subsystems. They have a function, especially in specific applications, but they are not required for the basic performance of the drone. So they're peripheral. So given this, what happened? Different type of application for the drone technology may take the form of small variation, in which case we call it a generational innovation, or they may be substantial. The linkages between peripheral and core system may change. We call them architectural, they tend to be more transformative. So all of these together give us the ability to describe the sort of the history, the life of a technology. We call it the life cycle of a technology. And we can say that looks like an S shape. So this is basically what I'm talking about. So what do we have? We have time on the horizontal axis. So at the beginning of the technology, what do we have? we have an increase, an improvement, a lot of tinkering of different firms, which increases the performance of the technology. So as we move outward, as the technology matures, we get an increase in performance. Now, there are several different measures of performance. We look at one at a time. So for example, this could be cars. Over time, automobiles have become better, and what they have become, therefore, safer. Or we could look at a different application. We could look at speed. Again, over time, they have become faster. Over time, they have become more gas efficient. So there are different measures of performance. And we can consider each one of them. But in general, the relationship between time, the tinkering, changes and modification to a technology, and each performance measure we can consider follows an S shape. So it increases, then we have really sort of the maturity of the product, we get a lot of change and improvement, and then eventually, as the technology starts becoming older, it tapers off. And eventually, something different, although related, that perform the same services emerge. Think of phones. Those of you that are old as me, we remember the old black big phones with the rotary on the front. You had to turn, you had to wait that the thing would come back. Then we went to, that was our first technology. They did become better and more elegant and function better over time, but basically still was the same technology. Then we got something that performed the same service, but it's different. This is an architectural innovation. We got cell phones. Okay. So this is the idea. Now, what does this have to do with regulation? What does regulation do? So we have a new technology that has all this possibility over time to develop in this way. So what does a regulation do? Regulation that is relevant to technological innovation is basically going to influence in some way the performance, or at least one dimension, one performance dimension of the technology. It may require to be better, or may require to actually be lower. So let's start with the first case. So this is our S curve as before. And what do we have? We have regulation imposing what we call the maximum performance boundary. So basically, it's the equivalent of imposing a performance ceiling. We are telling to the technology, you cannot do better than that. Let me give you the example in the case of drone. Very early in the process, in the development of the technology, of the drone technology, which is a transportation technology, regulation, the FAA, which is the Federal Aviation Administration, which is the regulatory agency in the United States that supervises the regulation of the drone industry, imposed a maximum weight. In other words, it imposes that in order to fly legally, all drones could not weigh more than 55 pounds, including their cargo. If you think about it, what that meant is that fundamentally, if we look at the weightlifting performance of drones, it was capped here at 55. There you go. That's why we call it a ceiling. Couldn't go above that. It would have been illegal. So all the possible applications of the technology that require lifting more than that were automatically ruled out. So for example, taxi drones, the big one we saw, that immediately became illegal, because clearly, unless you're lifting up, the weight of a drone that can carry a person by itself exceeds 55 pounds, which is about 20 kilos. So what we have is, again, a maximum performance boundary that imposes a ceiling. So it caps all a bunch of potential applications of the new technology, which means it also shows what that technology is going to look like, how it develops. So in the case of a maximum boundary, for example, we have two cases. We have the smaller air taxi, and we have the camera drone, the one that takes pictures, the towing. In the US, those are sold, the cheaper version, it costs about $29. And of course, the imposition of a maximum boundary in the US, and I'm just using one of the examples I could use, imply that that chunk was out of the market immediately. Anything that was the delivery drones, out of the market. So it immediately has, as we see, an impact of what feature of the technology are going to emerge. There is no incentive for firms to continue pushing on certain type of technology. What we are going to see is a lot of effort redirected toward the small drones. What else can technology do? Regulation do? As we said before, it can impose a different type of performance requirement, namely what we call a performance floor. In other words, you can say to a technology, you got to deliver at least this. You cannot do less than so much. So again, in the case of the drones, what we have is a requirement that was the addition of a peripheral subsystem to any drone technology. Specifically, any type of drone that could be used for commercial application was required to include a sense and avoid technology, which means basically the ability of the drone to avoid objects while flying. The point is that because the technology is so new, the sense and avoid technology was required by regulators, but the parameters were not specified. So what we have is that when a minimum performance floor is introduced, so we have the technology developing, reaching different type of performance. In our case, would be the ability of the drone to fly by itself. And then suddenly what we have is an interruption. Basically, all the applications, the potential application of that technology that could be possible are eliminated from the market until the required peripheral subsystem, which de facto is elevated to a core subsystem, can be introduced, which means it has to be developed. And so depending on how high that threshold is, it may be a level that is never reached. And so that de facto kills the technology, which actually there was pressure in the US drone technology for that to happen by imposing very severe regulatory requirements. This was under lobbying pressure of the pilot association, but they failed. So again, what we have in this case is the imposition of a minimum boundary for the technology, similar to a performance floor. So think of, again, just to use another example, automobile. The maximum boundary we were talking about before could be speed. So we have cars that could drive at 300 miles an hour, but they cannot because we have a maximum speed limit. Again, I'm not making statements about the desirability or non-desirability of regulation or certain limits. I'm simply making the argument. I'm trying to show how, regardless of motivation, regulation changes. It's really deeply entangled with the kind of technology we observe, especially and its application, especially in new markets where the product standards are not yet developed. Okay. And of course, these have strong implications for the kind of services we observe. So let's go back to the question. Does regulation influence the type of technological innovation? Yes, because it influences the life cycle of technology. So all the potential, all the potential applications are not all possible anymore. Not only that, but what we have is a change in incentive for different firms to behave in different ways. That brings me to the second question. So if regulation does influence the type of technological innovation, does it also shape competition in an industry? And the answer is, of course, yes. Because if you think about, we can walk it through logically. Clearly, not all firms are going to be influenced by a regulation in the same way, especially by a regulation. Again, we're talking about regulations that impose performance boundary, whether they are ceilings or floors. So if you think on the case of the drones, if I am a startup focusing on delivery drones and developing cages that allow package delivery, that means the imposition of a weight limit makes a substantial difference for the applicability of my technology, for how much my services may or may not be in demand, for my ability to get financing. And so there is a substantial impact. While if I am a firm who's specializing on toy drones or hobby drones, the small ones, fundamentally that's irrelevant. They are never going to be 55 pounds heavy. Okay, so there is an asymmetric effect, and this asymmetric effect is likely to penalize more entrepreneurial firms because they tend to be the one that have more focus, more interest in architectural innovation. They tend to be the ones with more technologically advanced innovation. So they penalize. So let me clarify this point. So we have a constraint imposed on all firms. It is likely that entrepreneurial firms are penalized more than others. But of course, all firms focusing, in the case of drones, on drones, or delivery drones, or on air taxis, all of them are going to be penalized. The big example here was Amazon, who was very early involved in the development of delivery drones. They had prototypes that were first to market. They could not even try their drones. And as a result, what they did, they moved their trial facilities overseas. So there are clearly firm level implications. The introduction of regulations, regardless of motivation, is going to alter the competitive landscape. By sort of influencing certain type of firms more than others, depending on size and depending on their field of specialization, of course, the introduction of performance boundaries. This slide is particularly about ceilings, but we can make an analogous argument in the case of floors, minimum requirement. Then, of course, it has also an impact on the industry level, depending on their expertise. Again, some firms are going to be penalized more than others, which means certain market segments are not going to emerge at all. What we are going to get in the case of a maximum boundary, if you remember, this is the picture, it's basically a lot of architectural innovation. It's just going to be automatically driven out of the market. So what firms are going to do is specialize in small incremental innovation. So we are going to get all the segments corresponding to the realization up here, they're going to be gone, at least until the regulation is changed or removed. And what we're going to get is that it's a lot of tinkering and a lot of small incremental change. So we are not going to get a substantially different type of phone, but we are going to get the iPhone 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Now, normally, that's what firms do. Of course, there are different strategic ways to compete and different combination of both generational and architectural innovation. But in this case, all the firms have left is basically tinkering on models. So making changes at the margin as opposed to trying to push for a more substantial way to apply a different technology. The same argument can be done in the case of the performance floors. Again, depending on their expertise, some firms are going to be penalized more than others. Here we are talking about having to add a new piece. For example, in the US now, all new cars are required to have a camera that allows you to see in the back. That's relatively easy to do, but still, that means that firms that had already incorporated that component in their technology were advantaged. The same for emission requirements. So what we have in general is that regulations that influence the performance, the minimum performance or maximum performance allowed legally, are going to have asymmetric effects on different types of firms based on their size, based on their expertise, and that because of that, we are going to have a competitive landscape that is substantially more fierce in certain areas we are going to have possible market segments that are never going to emerge. And we are going to have a redistribution of first mover advantage. So it would be great to have by now drones that could go in emergency areas and lift people out of danger. We don't have those yet, although the technology exists. What we can do is only use them, for example, to dump fire retardants or to distribute medical emergency supplies. But because of some of the regulation distortion, we don't have these applications. We also have distortions in terms of first, who gets the first mover advantage. Delivery drones. Amazon was there first. They lost the first mover advantage because the only way for them to develop prototypes was to apply for what was called a regulation, an exemption to regulation 333, which took about a year to get, and it was example specific. So every time that they wanted to test a drone, even in the desert, they had to require a regulatory permit. And notice, I'm not talking about a little company, I'm talking about Amazon. So there is power here. Okay, so what we have is sort of this entanglement again between regulation and the technology that generate an exogenous redistribution of competitive advantage, first mover advantage, competencies, the application of the technology we get. So what? Just to summarize very quickly, what we have is the regulation influences the emergence of innovation beyond stimulating it or slowing it down. Again, we now know that it influences the type. And it also influences the industry by redistributing first mover advantage, by basically eliminating changing incentives so that the number of market segments in an industry usually decreases, but the number of market niches increases, which means you have more competition, more pressure on prices. Again, there are implications for firms. Okay, so what? So we know yes, the first question, yes, the second question, because the effect on firms are uneven. But given the consideration we have made, so where does this leave entrepreneurial firms, which, as we discussed, are the ones that tend to be more influenced by the process of regulation? Should they be involved? And again, the answer is yes, again, because as I was saying at the beginning, they have this often neglected but very important thing to offer to the regulatory process, which is technological knowledge. So again, we tend to think of regulation suddenly comes out of the blue. There is somewhere a regulator. The US, we think, okay, it's Congress, it's the Senate, it's somebody. But how does it work in practice? Okay, so normally there is some initial inquiry into an emerging technology for whatever reason, often prompted by some other related industries. And that means, and that gets the attention of Congress. Again, I'm not going to make statements in terms of this is desirable, this is not desirable. I'm assuming regulatory intent, which makes, basically I'm trying to make my argument as strong as possible by doing it in a neutral scenario. So there is so Congress gives the responsibility to any one of its regulatory agencies to look into this new technology. In the case of drones, what we have is the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. Why then? Well, those things fly, so they got to fall under their supervision. And so what do we have? Well, there are different routes. It may be that the regulatory agency decided, no, this is really not, it doesn't fall under my purview, it should go somewhere else and so on. But very often what happens is that the regulatory agency decided, okay, this falls under my jurisdiction, but we don't really know much about. Again, I'm making the case that this is particularly important for new and emerging technologies for which there is not yet a product standard developed. Those are important because these are the technology that shape basically how our life is going to look in the future. So what happened in this case? The regulatory agency starts a knowledge acquisition process. And this knowledge acquisition process goes through, it's at the bottom of this slide, goes through the formation of federal advisory committees, which are exactly what the words say. They are committees formed by experts of different sorts that inform the regulatory process. Now, what's important is that those agencies are actually the agency where the basic body of the regulation is normally written. Then it gets presented to the regulator, but 90%, this is just a matter of approving what the Federal Advisory Committee, the FAC, approves. And this is a picture of a Federal Advisory Committee in session. This is actually a Federal Advisory Committee meeting on the implementation of drone technology. So you said we have a bunch of people. As similar to students, not all of them are paying attention at all the time. This guy's clearly checking his messages. I think he might be doing some emailing anyway. But so this is a Federal Advisory Committee. This is the way they look. So who are these people? Who's sitting there? In other words, these are the people that are actually informing the regulation. They're the ones who actually will prepare it. Okay. Notice, by the way, this is not just a secondary process. Federal Advisory Committee play a major role in determining regulation. Okay, so in 2017 alone in the United States, there was about 1,100 committees. There were 700 subcommittees involving more than 53 government agencies. So this is a massive process. Think of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, what has been going on with COVID and the vaccine. All the information about what was going on there was also channeled through the equivalent of Federal Advisory Committees. So this is the first, so who are the people sitting in that room? Okay. This is actually a schematic composition of a Federal Advisory Committee on drones, namely the first one. So April 1st, 2018. Okay. Now, what's important here is that if you look, we have, who's sitting there? We have one university, because they should know. We have government agencies. Then we have association. Now, it's interesting. Look at the association. We have Remote Aircraft Association, and then we have a lot of airlines and pilots association. If you think about it, makes sense, because why suddenly all these regulations based around drones? Because there were related industries, basically everything that had to do with transportation, that felt immediately involved and wanted to have a say in what this new technology could do. If I am a pilot and I found out that there is something being made that is actually pretty safe, it flies, and it doesn't need me to drive it, then I am concerned. But who do we have on the firm side? In other words, the companies that work on the technology. Fundamentally, nobody, or the people, or the companies, or the firms that were working on drone technology. What we have is model aircraft companies. Initially, drones were treated as model airplanes. And then at a certain point, they were treated actually as airplanes. So the requirement, for example, for flying with a remote control, a little drone, becomes the equivalent to having a line to flying a Boeing 747. And then what we have defense contractors. So people that do have expertise in drones, but it's a completely different animal. So what we have is that initially the regulatory process, as we can see, its influence is informed not at all by the industry, by the people who are actually developing not only the technology, but also the business models that make that technology valuable, feasible. They know the application, they know the applicability, they know the risks. Okay, so there is a mismatch, and that's when we get constraints, boundaries that are somehow extremely disruptive and constraining the technology. So you cannot fly anything that weighs more than 55 pounds, including its weight. Or another regulation that was imposed was you cannot fly a drone beyond the line of sight. You have to see it. Okay, that means that any kind of rescue drone we can conceive is automatically out of the picture. So there will be sort of mismatch between the technology potential and what it can do for our life in a positive and in a negative, and who was informing the process. And this matters, this is important. Okay? On a side line, this is of course also clearly, it extends George Stigler's idea that firms will attempt to regulate away potential substitutes. As we've seen, what we have is military drone makers that didn't want the risk. The large powerful companies like Amazon, Google is another one involved, and others could potentially intervene or invade their market, as well as pilots. Okay? So in the context of an emerging industry, again, we have strong attempts to regulate away potential substitutes. But if you think about it, that's got substantial implications for technological change in the economy. Okay? So what happened? Well, there were another 4 or 5 federal advisory committees formed on drones that fundamentally kept the same structure, the same makeup. Things did not change until, if I remember correctly, I believe this is the 5th Federal Advisory Committee on Drones, 2015. So we go from 2008, April 1st, 2008, the first Federal Advisory Committee on Drones, to 2015, before we start seeing change whereby companies that were actually developing the technology and working on business model are included in the regulatory process. That's 7 years. In technology years, 7 years is a lifetime. It made a substantial difference in terms of the development of the technology, where the technology was developed. A lot of American companies were abroad, which is why before I showed you example of blood delivery via drone in Switzerland, medical devices being distributed via drones in Rwanda, of small air taxi drones being used in Kuwait. Iceland has also had some experimentation with delivery with smaller drones. So a lot of the companies that were developing stuff in the US went abroad. And a lot of other companies just did not pursue their opportunity anymore because it was too costly and too risky. Again, early in the emergence of a technology, the regulatory process, the emergence of a technology and an industry is always uncertain. But then if the regulatory process is so involved and so uncertain, it makes things substantially worse, again, asymmetrically worse for small firms. So it took for 7 years before drone manufacturers, non-military drone manufacturers, were actually included. And that only happened because the small UAV and unmanned aerial vehicle drones coalition was formed. This coalition was basically formed by large and powerful companies such as Amazon, Google, Best Buy, and smaller startups like DJI, 3D Robotic, who eventually failed, Measures, and others. So it was a coalition. Now you may say, okay, why would somebody like Google and Amazon need small companies? That's exactly my point. We want entrepreneurial firms to be involved in the regulatory process. Why? Because they have the knowledge. So while Amazon, Google, Uber were working with other companies to develop different applications of the technology, normally big ones with broad disruptive application, transportation, delivery, and so on. They did not have yet a viable business model. Business models came from the from the consumer side of small drones, which were developed primarily by small companies. These small companies knew better what worked, how it worked, and were behind the development of crucial core systems that the larger company, the incumbent, needed in their technology. So it was clear that in order for the coalition to be credible and successful, it had to include both large companies who had the resources and the political way, but it also needed the entrepreneurial firm who had the technological know-how. They had basically the knowledge advantage. And that's when finally we start seeing the regulation on drones to become more suitable for in other words, we start seeing distinction between how a commercial drone is regulated from how a consumer drone is regulated. Again, I'm talking about the United States. What kind of requirements apply to different type of applicability, the necessity to apply for an exemption even every time that a new prototype has to be tested were removed. In other words, we see more fluidity where the abilities and the potentiality of the technology starts getting realized, and the regulatory environment becomes somehow more conducive. So going back to our third question, should entrepreneurial firms be included in the process of regulating technological innovation? The answer is certainly yes. Because entrepreneurial firms, and not only because we like entrepreneurial firms, they are innovative, they are at the center really of the technological process of change, but because they have a knowledge advantage, and therefore they make a desirable partner for both coalitions, fair coalitions, and regulatory agencies. They bring something, they have a regulatory currency. Their knowledge advantage represents a regulatory currency that is valuable for both incumbents, agencies, and ultimately for us, because we are the ultimate user of this technology. So what are the highlights? Regulation has unintended consequences. It shapes the type of innovation we get in emerging industry, it reshapes the competitive landscape, and increases the importance of our market strategy. We have a lot of attention and resources being devoted to actually informing the regulatory process. But we know that the important point, again, this, it's true, and it holds regardless of regulatory motivation, regardless of intent. Again, the point here wasn't to talk in favor or against regulation, but just to become more aware and cognizant of what the regulatory process actually, how it works and what it does. Touchline, what I just gave you, regulation and technological innovation are entangled. The challenges of regulatory reform, therefore, are institutional. So the process, that federal advisory committee process that informs the regulation, it's important. How it is structured, it's important. How subject to capture it is, it's important. And on top of this, we should keep in mind that human enterprise and innovation always find their ways, which is wonderful on one side, but institutions will enable these ways to be productive. Will Baumol wrote a wonderful article in 1990, Productive, Unproductive, and Destructive Entrepreneurship, in which he made the point, basically, we are going to get entrepreneurship whether we like it or not. So it would be nice if the institutional context is one that is conducive actually to productive entrepreneurship. And I think there's a lot that we can do with the right regulatory process and the way in which it's constructed. So I leave you with the image of these machines, which I think is really beautiful, just aesthetically great. And I'll be excited to continue the conversation in the form of questions. And I thank you very much for listening to me, for your patience. It has been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Very interesting lecture. And normally you would receive a warm hand of applause now, but we'll do that next time we have the opportunity to welcome you in person in Stockholm. I have three broad areas for questions that I would like to raise during our conversation. I'll get back to the details after Christina and Pontus' comments, but your talk is very timely for, at least from a Swedish and European perspective. We have one set of questions which I would like to, perhaps if Christina and Pontus as well touch upon, is the emerging discussion on how to regulate the digital market in Europe. with significant implications for not only big tech firms, but also for small and entrepreneurial firms, and of course, technological innovation. So that's a set of questions I'd like to touch upon. A second set of questions is, I noticed that we have participants from responsible ministries for the regulatory process in Sweden participating here, and we are undergoing attempts to improve and reform the regulatory process in Sweden, and some of the proposals actually touch upon your research in terms of how and when to include entrepreneurs and stakeholders into that process. So perhaps we can, and I encourage the participants to post questions in the chat. And I would also like you to, if we have time to, if you could say a few words on a special interest of mine, and that is labor regulations. So if you have anything on labor regulations and its impact on technological innovation. And that is also coming from a very Swedish perspective, because we have labor regulations in Sweden that have been put in place with the argument that they do in fact accelerate technological innovation and make Sweden more competitive. So if we have time, we can talk about that. But before handing over to the commentators, I would like to ask one question immediately, which was posed by Bengt Möllerud in the chat. And the way I interpret Bengt's question is that he essentially asked you if you could elaborate between the different trajectories in military development and civil development of drone technology, and if this is parallel developments or on a divergent trajectories, and how regulations come into play here. So let's start with that question.
You want me to address that? I can do that.
If you could address the last one.
Just very, very quickly, for the sake of accuracy, I think that I should say that in a sense, I don't know, because we focused really on non-military drone data. That's all the archival work we did. Being able to compare the two would have required basically a different data set. I have only sort of anecdotal evidence, because there were some cases in which, again, Almantas is really the person who did the painstaking archival work. And it looks like the type of innovation, the potential applicability of the technology for consumers and commercial users were enormously broader than what we have seen in the military industry. The impression, and I'm somewhat speculating, is that when it comes to the military industry, we have seen primarily size, speed. So the kind of technological change, the type of change that from a technology point of view, we will consider almost generational, just that the implications are so huge that, but again, I'm somewhat speculating, just because it would have been a completely different data collection process. And a lot of it, I'm not sure we would have access to it. I just don't know.
Thank you very much, Maria. Christina, professor at Royal Institute, the floor is yours to give comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria. It was a wonderful talk and very interesting to me. I'm only familiar with the $29 version of a drone that my son has. So there was a lot of news to me here. So that's wonderful. It's a pity that you couldn't come to Stockholm, because if you had come here, you might have noticed that there's a lot of electrified scooters all over the streets in Stockholm right now, and probably in other cities as well. And these has been, of course, increasingly popular in many large cities. And in fact, it's just recently, last week, that there was some regulation announced and introduced in order to handle the situation of having too many scooters and accidents occurring and so on. So as from January 1st, the number of scooters will be reduced by 50%, and the number of competitors will be reduced to 3 actors in the Stockholm area, and there will be fees introduced and a lot of rules and speed limits and things like that that will influence this market. And this case actually made me think about that the regulatory situation might be very different compared to your situation with the drones. Because in this case, there's a lot of, there's not that much regulation in place already, and the entrepreneurs might potentially not have that much incentives to be involved in the regulatory process, because they might want to reap the benefits that they have right now in the current situation. So in your situation with the drones, on the other hand, you have chosen this industry as an industry with heavy regulation as one of the motives, and it's crucial for the actors here to influence the regulation to make their business, so to say. So that's 2 different cases. The third one would be that there might be some regulation at hand, but there's kind of loopholes or gaps that still enables entrepreneurs to find these gaps and loopholes. One example might be a Swedish entrepreneur, Jan Stenbeck, that Maria, you don't know anything about him, but he wanted to introduce commercial broadcasting to Sweden, but that was not permitted, but he managed through the digital transformation to broadcast through satellites from London instead, in order to be able to do that in the Swedish market. So there might be different statuses or different regulations already existing that might influence the best strategy of the entrepreneurs. And hence my question to you would be if you have any thoughts about I mean, how to handle these different types of situation, given that the technology that are to be introduced are facing these different regulatory situations that I mentioned here, from regulations that needs to be handled, no regulation, and perhaps regulation existing but gaps to be exploited. So that's my first question.
Do you want me to try to answer now?
Please go ahead.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. First of all, I'm so happy that you brought up electrical scooters, because Almantas, who's currently in France, we were talking about doing a different application, sort of basically replicating the drone work, and he brought up electrical scooters. In the US, we are starting to see a lot of them, and it's interesting because they are popping up a lot in some cities, but not in others. So dominant in Washington. So there is a lot of, and so we were looking about electrical scooters, and one of the things we were thinking about was to do something competitive. So you may get a call. So let me see if I sort of, I'm going to start from the second case. The gentleman was actually broadcasting from London, because I love that kind of stuff, because to me, that's exactly the point I was touching upon the last slide. Human creativity is there and is going to express itself in one way or another. And so the question is, can it be challenged in a way that is productive? Regulation, one of my old professors said, it's like surgery. If you really, really need it, then you want it, but you got to, but there is too much of a useful thing. And so there are, the more convoluted the regulatory environment is, the more likely it is that there will be loopholes, that there will be way arounds, or simply that the how you call it, the monitoring of the system is going to be costly and impossible, and so people will circumvent it. And so the question is, what is the best way to channel again something that people are going to be able to do in any case? So what you are describing again, I think, is to some extent the normal outcome of basically trying to constrain something that it's against human nature. People come up with solutions. I give an example that is somewhat different but related. In the United States, there has been, and this touches upon the Johan comment before about labor regulation. The United States, we are seeing, this is not technology, but we are seeing an increasing number of professions where workers, and I'm talking about, in many cases, low-skilled service industries, things like delivering, moving, hairdressing. They are required in many towns to sign non-competing agreements, which is really strange. Or if you think about, or licensing requirements are popping up all over the place. And what we observe when we look at data, one of my students is looking at data on the moving industries and on tattooing parlors, is that the number, as more and more licensing requirements are introduced, the number of people operating without a license is actually increasing. And that's partly because those industries are already established. And so for people, it's very easy to hide in plain sight. They can just perform. Their legal status is sort of given for granted. Again, it's impossible to monitor some regulation that is overarching. And so I think that that's sort of a really a call to regulators to use regulator with parsimony, to use regulation with parsimony, because I think people work around, and that imposes more cost than the benefit we get often from intensive regulation. The other point was the electrical scooter. We are saying basically there wasn't a regulation, so what we got is a CEO of these things. I think that entrepreneurs would actually be interested in jumping on the regulatory wagon, simply because they probably want to have a say in protecting their market in one way or the other. But I don't know enough of the details to say, what is a good way to do this. It seems to me like there have been some very strong intervention already put in place, like cutting competition by 50%. That's a heck of an intervention.
Yeah. Just to comment on that, I think that raises another interesting question that I wanted to ask you a little bit, because I don't know about this specific case either, about the electrical scooter, whether the firms were asked to be involved or not, or whether it's a policy decision not to get them involved and handle this on their own, so to say. I don't know how this process was in the Swedish case, but I think there might be an issue here that I was intending to ask you about. Naturally, your question, if entrepreneurs should be involved in the regulatory process, that the answer to that was yes. And since you asked this question, I kind of get the feeling that they are not sufficiently involved. And the question was then why? And is it on the policymaker side or on the entrepreneurial side?
I think the answer is, I think that's really an empirical question. I think it's industry specific. But in general, I think it's more of the blindness is on both sides. I think that in many cases, the entrepreneurs don't realize they actually have a bargaining chip to use. And it's also true that they suffer from a size and resource constraint effect. But sort of industry association and groups and coalitions, those I think are the way for them to sort of mobilize themselves. And probably the more technologically intense the industry is, the more likely it is that we are going to see something like that, simply because the group of people is going to be smaller, they're going to know each other, there's sort of more of a community. And so the idea of having almost like a bottom-up movement, it's more likely. So this is from the entrepreneurial side. And certainly I think the myopia may be also from the regulatory side. And again, I continue arguing on from the lens of regulatory neutrality, is because entrepreneurial firms are more difficult to identify, and I think regulators, like all other human beings, tend to look for what's more evident in front of their eyes. The drone case is really interesting because Amazon spent quite a ton of lobbying money trying to get on the Federal Advisory Committee early on. Somehow they made a partnership with Google and they still didn't get there until they were able to provide evidence of workable, actually working business models. In other words, until they included 3DR and I don't remember who the other two firm measures, I think was another one, basically anti-entrepreneurial firms. Of course, that's more easily done again in a highly technological environment where different firms know each other and they know who is doing what. One last very small point with respect to regulation and how do you inform the regulatory process. I think also that redundancy matter. And so when you're talking about expertise, this is from the regulator point of view, you want expertise from different angles. You want almost a competition among experts. Otherwise, the risk of one-sidedness is going to be enormous. But I hope this somehow engages your very important question.
Definitely. I will not be that lengthy. I'll also let Pontus ask his question. I will just pass on a quote from this guy with broadcasting from London before you virtually leave Sweden. I really love your last slide. I think it was when you say that human enterprise and innovation always find their ways. And this John Steenbeck entrepreneur, one of his most cited quotes is that politics always beats business, but technology always beats politics. So with that said, I'll let Pontus ask his.
Thank you, Christina. Pontus, floor is yours.
Thank you, Johan. Thank you, Christina. And primarily thanks, Maria, for a super interesting and highly policy relevant presentation. You used the drone industry to generalize insights that more broadly apply to emerging industry. I think that's a remarkably pedagogic approach to it. Great presentation. So one of your first slide, you mentioned that the drone industry was like a generalized purpose technology. And I found that because I had the opportunity to look at the slides before the rest of you, I found that a little bit hard to digest, actually, comparing it with electricity and digitization, etc. But the more I listened to you and the more I looked at the slides, the more convinced I actually became. So I think it is a relevant parallel where the drone industry actually shares a lot of characteristics with those type of technologies. So it influences a number of different types of industries, or has the potential to do so. It spawns innovation, etc. So I thought that was a very relevant pick of industry, and also to answer the three questions you had. When I first glanced through your slides, I thought, why involve another stakeholders like the entrepreneurs or smaller firms or younger firms? Wouldn't there be an increased risk of regulatory capture? You're fighting for the regulations to be designed so that they favor your particular business or industry. But then I realized that it was more a counterbalance effect that you were advocating here, right? Bringing them in and their expertise. The whole thing here is there is a two-way dynamics, I would say. Don't know whether you agree, but technology affects regulations, and regulations affects technology. And if you go back in history, early 20th century, you need a guy walking with a flag in front of the cars, etc., when they were driven in the streets in cities, at least. And today you have the fintech industry, which I think has prompted several regulations when it comes to payments, modes of payments, and access to banks, clients, etc. So the question is here, how do you actually design a process that hypothetically will come up with optimal regulations? It may be a risk that the entrepreneur's views will be dwarfed by other interests, and that lobbying being frequent in the US, we're picking up greatly in Brussels, I think, but we do have a bit of different structures in coming up with regulations. I mean, it requires a lot of competencies, integrity, and skills by those who are actually regulators, politicians, and people working in authorities. Is this the optimal way to do it, or could we think of some other way in sort of getting at the core of what would be advantageous from a societal point of view when we formulate regulations? So I would like to hear your view a little bit on that. And then my second question would have to do with the market structure that you emphasized in your talk also, which I think is also extremely relevant because it has to do with the competitiveness of an industry or even a nation. But here you had a sort of closed economy perspective, because it doesn't preclude that different market segments are developed in other countries or other regions if you have regional differences. And that is what we have seen with the supply chain, etc., that we do specialize in particular areas of the value-added or production chain. So do you think that would change if you had more of an international or global perspective and linkages to suppliers and inventors, innovators in other countries? Would that same risk that you indicate here, would that be as present then? So those are my two initial questions.
Maria?
Yes, I was having trouble in unmuting myself. Let me start with the second one very quickly. So I like competition. I think competition is brutal in many ways, but it also pushes us to make better products, better decisions. And so I think that if we could take a more global approach, everybody would benefit. The fact that in the case of drones, for example, the fact that regulation, one of the things that was interesting in the case of drones is that they got very heavily regulated before they were even brought to market. So it was sort of preventive regulation. And the result is that a lot of companies went abroad. Zipline is probably one of the most advanced company in technology, drone technology for delivery. They operated in Rwanda because they couldn't stay in the US. They didn't have the kind of financial cushion that a Google or an Amazon have. And so for them was, we either die, as some company did, or we go abroad. They went abroad. So I think that the open market is, it's one of the great.
So it may be a local welfare loss, but globally it apply anyway.
Exactly. You know, the application. If we think about the way we deal with sort of green technologies, I mean, the applications are. So I think the benefit would be just enormous. And of course, you know, it's easy for me to talk, but then the devil is in the details. There are, you know, it's a difficult process. I'm thinking, for example, of this is different but related, the Bayh-Dole Act. The initial idea was to protect invention in small companies, I mean, in developing countries. And what we got as a result is that indeed it's doing a better job of protecting the interests of rich countries, which, if we think about it, of course, makes sense because the small countries don't have the resources to develop the kind of vaccines that or medicines that we wanted them to develop. And so now we are going around it with exemptions. And so, but that sort of defeats the purpose. And so it becomes this complex web, which brings me to the previous point you were making. What's the best way to regulate? I think you are absolutely right. You know, it's sort of a two-way street. And actually, I think it's even more complicated than that. And it was between the effect of technology, regulation of technology, and the technology of regulation by verse, which is why I tend to use the word entanglement. Because sometimes in a couple of occasions in my life, I tried to write papers where I was showing some causal effect business. And when you really try to do it seriously and looking at how the regulations are written, it's very difficult to disentangle these things. They are so intertwined, which in a sense, you went really at the core of my talk. The point was, look, regardless of motivation, there is this big, again, I come up with the word entanglement, this big sort of interlocking of pieces here. We can't get away from it, and that's distortionary. It's going to have effects that may even be net positive. We don't know that, but certainly there are going to be winners and losers. It changes the way things develop. So how do you do it better? That's a very good point. The answer is, I wish I knew. The only thing that I can say is, after all, what are we talking about? We are talking about the way in which regulators are informed about the technology, sort of an education process, right? The point is, one side we have the companies that are doing, we have the inventors, we have the people who are developing the technology. On the other side, we have the regulators who are trying to do something good, but they don't really know what they're dealing with. And so it's an informing process. And what I think one component, I think, and how to shape this information process is to create redundancy, which is why I think it's important to have entrepreneurial firms in the process. The regulator should hear from a variety of constituencies. Okay. In general, when we're talking about regulation, I think redundancy, replication, sort of a competition of information is important. And I give you an example. Think of COVID and how many screw-up advisors countries and country experts have provided. I mean, we could really make a list of people who had come out after a while saying, well, yeah, I said that, I didn't know, or I said it in that way because I thought it was good for, I mean, are you kidding me? So again, maybe if it had been a more competitive process of providing information so that we remove so that the information is not one-sided, then maybe we would get better answers. Maybe this is as far as I wish I had a better answer for that question. I think that's one of the big policy questions for us to address.
Yeah, it was a more of an elaborative discussion, I would say. But I think it's only 5 minutes left, and I think there are a few questions in the chat. So I rest my case here.
Yeah. Thank you, Pontus. I think there are plenty of questions, and I have a few pages myself here, but I'll repeat the questions from the chat, and then if we have time for a last round of comments from Pontus, Christina, and Maria. But one question, which is to some extent we already covered, but how do you rate the risk that incumbent uses regulations as a process to keep substitute out the market? We've already addressed this, but I interpret it as, how can you say anything about how frequent regulatory capture is, if there are any empirical evidence on that? And then
I think
please.
Let me give you the 30 seconds. It's very common. And in fact, that's what we have seen even in the drone industry. If you think about the slides with the first Federal Advisory Committee, we had all the, quote, disrupted industry. They were the ones that actually sort of triggered the process. The airlines, the helicopter industry, the pilots association, they were the ones concerned about these new products. So they were the ones who triggered the process. It took 7 years for the actual emerging industry to actually have a voice. So if we pay attention to that side early on, I think the possibility of capture. Again, let's make people talk.
Yep.
I'm trying to be quick.
Yeah, understand. That leads us to another question by Jon Simonsson, which is related to, in my understanding, on the regulatory process and institutional reform. And his question is, how do we create incentives and governance that stimulates agile regulatory change at public agencies?
That is in the details, really, but the quickest and sort of pretty generic answer is what I was trying to say before. I think we need redundancy. I think we need different agency competing basically for the regulatory attention. If we had that, for example, before certain suggestions were made about what to do with COVID, maybe we would have had a better outcome faster. So redundancy. Just often the comment that I get against redundancy about it's costly. You can't have. No, not really. I think that it's much more effective than actually the cost that we incur because of regulatory capture.
Then I have a quick follow-up question on that final remark. Is that an argument that actually, if you take it to the European context, that we should encourage regulatory competition between member states?
I would love that, but I don't know that I am. In principle, I think so.
Yep.
That would be my.
Any thoughts on? So we have about 1 minute left now, but so a final question then. What is your view on experimental regulation? So you have separate zones where you essentially experiment with policy and regulations. Yeah.
Actually, I tend to favor decentralization in many cases. And so that goes hand in hand with experimental, because yes, there may be failure, but that would be on a smaller scale than if you have a major failure from the top. And I'm going to take 30 seconds to give you a very quick example. We have had this very conversation about anti-homelessness policy in the United States. Trying to be quick, about 7 years ago, the US is spending currently about the federal level, only at the federal level, more than $8 billion with a B dollars for the fight against homelessness. Completely changed what is the suggested best practice on how to fight homelessness, which means a lot of the organization, all the organizations that receive this money in order to fight homelessness locally, changed what they were doing. In particular, they moved from a sort of emergency hostel ties to what is called first housing. Basically, people are put in housing, even though they may not be housing ready. So there was this change simply because, okay, this is where the money is coming from. So the incentive changed. Okay, that was a top-down process. Basically, this is the new best practice. The best practice, unfortunately, had been piloted in New York City and San Francisco, which are the two highest rental real estate markets in the United States. So the problem of homelessness in those cities is completely different than it may be in Mississippi. So what was a successful best practice there was broad, well, the incentive were pushed in the direction. It didn't work. Now they are backpedaling. So in the context of what you're saying, my approach and what has been found, that is one of my colleagues who's doing this work, is basically to say, look, if you look at the best outcomes we have seen in terms of reducing homelessness, these are all local action, local practices. And so this is sort of an experimental thing. Locally, people are doing things. Some fail, some work. The failure is never going to be $8 billion. And so this, let's leave bottom-up, competitive, different environment to respond at what the needs locally are. These complex social problems, regulation is one of them, normally have different aspects and facets, which I think can be addressed. In other words, one size rarely fits all. That it addresses your problem.
Thank you very much, Maria. This was a fantastic talk and a very wonderful discussion. I wish we could keep on talking, but let's settle for, I hope we get to see you in Stockholm pretty soon.
I would love that.
Yeah.
I would love that.
Again, thank you very much. And thank you, Christina and Pontus, for your comments. And thank you for participating in this seminar. Look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Bye-bye.